Ladies and gentlemen,
Good evening.
Are you ready?
Okay, here we go.
You're listening to the Deal Room Podcast. Join us as we bring you the inside scoop on business sales and acquisitions. Get across trends in the area and hear the industry's best recount their real-life tips, traps, and experiences. Now, here's your host, Joanna Oakey.
Hi, it's Joanna Oakey here, and welcome back to the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. Now, today we have another episode in our Growth Through Acquisition series. And today we are looking particularly at strategic considerations in growth through acquisition. In order to talk about this meaty topic, we have on board Richard Osmann from Provanedge Advising, who advises and prepares companies for strategic growth by researching and validating growth and expansion plans and providing executive coaching for company professionals. So Richard deals with organisations both here in Australia and in the US. So today we have a really good cross-section, I guess, of talking about elements that are relevant here in Australia, but also across the seas in the US as well, and that generally are relevant no matter what the jurisdiction. So buckle in, here we go for our discussion with Richard Osmann, all about the strategic considerations in growth through acquisition. All right, Richard, I just wanted to say thank you for coming on board to the Deal Room Podcast.
Thank you. It's my pleasure. I really look forward to our time together.
I am looking forward to it. So, Richard, maybe we can kick it off by you giving us a really quick background of who you are and how you, your background of coming into this topic, talking about this area today.
So working with businesses that are growing, and there's a lot of different ways to do that. I've been working with them since 1999. This is a second career for me, so I'm on my 21st year. I'm obviously from the States, and I've spent. And
you say obviously.
But it's nice in Australia because I stick out because of the accent.
Yeah, very distinctive.
No, that's right. And I still have clients back in the States, and I continue to work there with communication technology. It's truly a global business, and I've been in Australia 7 years. I think over these 20 years, I don't know how many businesses I've worked with, but it's been in the multiple hundreds. I do have a doctorate, and so I approach this. The biggest thing I got from a doctorate was how to go from a novice to an expert in any particular topic. And I use that research when I'm working with my clients. And I think that's probably my point of difference.
And what was your doctorate in, by the way?
Well, it's in higher education. But research is research. And there's human and technical research. There's financial as well. And I just apply those tools to my work.
Yeah, okay. And so then the background of the way that you work with your clients is helping them in finding ways to support strategic growth.
Yeah, so we have what I call three legs to the stool of business. We have an online business academy, which are just the nuts and bolts of business, and it's quite robust. And so that's ProvanedgeBusinessAcademy.com. And then we do advising for businesses that already know how to operate on the basics, but are facing strategic growth. And that's very custom. And so that's Provanedge-strategicgrowth.com. And that includes, pretty comprehensive advising. And then the last leg on the stool is a lot of companies come to us because they want to raise capital. And oftentimes after we're done with our strategic advising, they find they can invest organically through smart cash flow, which means they don't need outside money when that's the cheapest money they're going to get is their own. And so that's kind of our, the work cover.
Yeah. Okay. All right. And so, of course, today we're talking about the general area of acquisition for growth for organisations, and of course that is part of the growth strategy for many organisations for very good reasons.
It can be a really fast way to grow because you're not developing another business, right? You're taking one that's already developed. And if you're in a related or similar field, you're taking a competitor out of the market.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, that's one of the things that, is smart to look at. But I think there are three key areas to really look at. And I'll just list them if that's okay.
Please list away,
Okay.
Rich. I'm here and listening. I'm interested.
Okay. So look, the first one's valuations. What is this worth? And everybody knows that, right? But you need to get below the numbers.
And what does that mean, getting below the numbers?
So we often have clients come to us and say, look, I want to acquire a company that has $2 million in annual turnover, as an example. Okay. How much should I pay for it? Well, that's like asking how long is a piece of string.
Yeah.
And so let's go into that. So it's not uncommon, I'll put it like that a company, let's say it's a $2 million company, doesn't really have a lot of systems in place. It's driven by the company owner, the principal, it can be, and the relationships that he's had and his motivation and his energy and his drive. So let me just kind of go through valuation. So that's the first thing that I think you need to look at is how dependent is this, the revenue on any one person versus company systems, because company systems will continue, but the company principal won't.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
The other thing is what has been the business strategy. In some sectors, you can grow organically with really no growth strategy and hit $2 million in annual revenue. Well, so what happens after you buy it? Because that's a future. See, so you need to look at it. Now, these are just things to think about, right? The other thing is that if the principal throws out something, so it's a $2 million business, and he thinks it's worth, $3 million, $4 million, $5 million, pick a number. Everybody who owns a business has a bias toward that business. It's called principal bias. And
yes, we hear about it a lot here on the podcast, and we see it a lot. Absolutely.
That's exactly. So there's a term for it. And that's why you need to get into what's going on in the business. How did they get here? And where will they go from here if the principal and honestly some of the key players aren't around? Because that's not unusual when a company is acquired, is that key people, whether it's an allegiance to the principal or those who owned it, personal connection, maybe just difference in personalities or whatever, that sometimes key people go, you know what, I think I'll work somewhere else now. Because that was a motivation then for them, to be involved. So you want to have an independent verification of values, and you want to look at not just the revenue, but you want to look at the net profit, and you really want to look at the operational budget and see where to look at expenses that and items that may not be a part of the company once you acquire it. Because one of the reasons to acquire a company like a competitor is you can consolidate overhead and into one central function. So you can sometimes find that the valuations, when you talk about multiple acquisitions, that the company is actually worth more because you're cutting overhead, because you're combining all those overhead expenses. Let me give you a quick story. There's a guy in the States that I know, and he was retiring from a manufacturing business, and he knew that insurance was one of these stable industries. And he took his payout. He was an executive. He took his payout, and what he started doing, he lived in a small town in Virginia, and he was buying up a lot of small independent mom and dad or husband and wife insurance companies, because they were all, the husband was usually the salesman, the wife was usually the office manager / bookkeeper. And he bought all these, but they had a brand, because it was the John Brown Insurance Agency, the Mary Smith Insurance Agency, everything else. So he acquired 16 of these independent insurance agencies. What he did was, because he was an executive, he consolidated all around the town he lived in. He consolidated all the back-end function, because the person who owned it that was on the sales side, he didn't like doing, usually as a guy, but there were a few women, didn't like to do the admin function anyhow, so they didn't do it very well. And And in essence, he cut half of the overhead out of these small businesses. And being bigger, he could also, spread the marketing and everything else over 16. And that's kind of a way that he grew a multi-million-dollar insurance agency by, acquiring 16. And he'd never been in insurance before.
I love it. So I'd really love that as an example, because quite often here what we actually see is that you have aggregators or businesses that are out acquiring multiple other businesses who are coming from a perspective of quite a strong financial base already. So already being fairly large organisations or experienced and entering into multiple acquisitions. But I love the stories of where a small business has been able to achieve massive growth by going around and acquiring small businesses, because it's something that I think small businesses, it is achievable for small businesses if they've got the right plan. And it's not necessarily high risk if they just start with a little one and then work out how that works and then add another little one. So it's a little bit different to the general concept of acquisition for growth, which is that you have a large organisation that knows what it's doing. And in this instance, it's a fabulous example of a small or micro business taking the concept of acquisitions to build them all together and then create something, of massive value at the end.
Well, your point's well taken, because he didn't buy all 16 at once. That's a mistake, right? So he bought a couple, consolidated. That was throwing off extra cash now. That funded the next purchase, and so on. He is very smart about it. But like I said, he was an executive in, in an industry and took early retirement, but didn't want to retire.
Yeah. And look, I love that, because, certainly we're working with a number of buyers at the moment that more of the buyer perspective that you're talking about here, that had started small and then have just sort of slowly dipped their toe in, bought one or two, realised that it was a really good strategy, bought a few more, and, are just really kicking some amazing goals here.
That's right.
Now. And I just think this is it's a perspective that many small businesses have just not thought about. And so right. I just love your example here. Brilliant. Okay, so moving on. So we've had a look at the idea of valuations and really understanding the picture behind the numbers. And if we're going to talk about the concept of valuations, then in relation to your example of the insurance aggregator, we'll call him, he obviously was able to go in and look at the businesses and find a way that he could rip costs out and therefore create, an exponential increase in the value of the businesses in comparison to the amount that he was paying. So I guess that's where that reflects back on that valuation discussion we're having. Are there any other elements, I guess, that he applied from that valuation perspective?
Well, right. So to keep the personal brand in the business, right. So if it was the John Brown Insurance Agency, that he, that the principal stayed on as an employee now of this company that acquired them. Mm-hmm. And then there was a transition plan, because people were buying from John Brown, for 10, 15, 20 years, whatever it had been. And it was important for that the individual brands remained. And then over time, these people wanted to retire. They wanted to do some, things. And so it was a transition over years. But by that time, he had gradually inserted a different brand. I won't tell you the name of the agency, but over time then, so it was a smooth transition to a different brand.
And what you're saying here, I just want to highlight, because I think this is absolutely critical, the approach of slow and steady. So acquiring and then slowly over time changing systems, slowly over time changing brands, because that's one of the mistakes that I see and certainly hear about quite a lot, is buyers coming in and just, having their own way of doing things but implementing it too quickly and creating issues for clients, for staff. Change is a hard thing, isn't it?
It is.
And buyers often just have so much energy for the vision that they have for the future, but the point we're talking about here is hold yourself back. Be a little bit more measured, take time to implement changes.
Well, I think that's the point, is to really have a strategic plan.
Yeah. Yeah.
And not just do it, ad hoc, being opportunistic. That's okay. And sometimes they're one-offs. But if you really want to do this smart, to really have a well thought out strategic plan.
Yep, absolutely. Brilliant. Okay, all right. So after valuations, where do we move on to next?
Well, the other thing is a risk management strategy, because when you've already talked about when you make change can be difficult, change can be hard. And this feeds a little bit into future values, but you have to ask yourself, what can go wrong and how can it go wrong? Obviously, changes are going to happen when you acquire a business. And there are new tax numbers, and and if you're consolidating overhead, there are new people involved, and people are reporting to new people, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to ask yourself that. So that's what can go wrong in the change. Okay.
Which can be an endless list. But I guess part of what we're reflecting on here is, and maybe it's even stepping back one step prior to that and saying, well, what is the real asset that I'm purchasing? And then what's the risk of that in transfer, and what can go wrong that could impact the value of that asset moving forward? I guess that's what we're talking about.
Well, you're just not purchasing an asset in present time. You're purchasing an asset for something in the future as well. And that's the risk management.
Yeah, absolutely. And so what are the things that you consider, or what are some of the things that you've seen that that have gone wrong, or that you think, the particular key focus areas from your experience?
Well, okay. So I think one of the common thing, if there's an acquisition that's outside of a geography or even a industry, it might be a related industry, is how much do you really know what's going on with that business?
Yeah.
Okay. So as an example, going back to the first example, all these small independent agencies that my friend acquired were probably within a 30-mile radius of the town he lived in.
Right.
Because that's where he lived all his life. He knew, and he was an executive at this manufacturing plant that was the biggest employer in the county and surrounding counties. So he knew everybody and everything. And that was his way of doing it. But if you're, in Sydney and you're buying somewhere and, you want to expand down to Melbourne and you're looking at an acquisition, well, you still want to know things like competitors. Who are they down there? We've already talked about principal risk. So these are all things to look at, but especially a competitor. And there's also market risk. And some market risks you just can't. With the coronavirus in January, who would have thought, cafes would be shut down for 3 months if you wanted to,
absolutely.
If you wanted to. So you can't cover all the risks, but you want to identify what you need to know that you don't know right now. And this is where folks like you or folks like me are real helpful, because we've done this, quite a few times, and even just the legal, and the laws between the two different states vary too. And so you want to make sure that if you're going to invest your money or anybody else's, that you really know all the risks that, legal risk, market risk, competitor risk, all these kind of things, technical risk. And maybe there aren't competitors right now, but they might be coming into the field, and you want to be able to see that as well.
And so, of course, this is where our fabulous due diligence comes in. But I guess what we're talking about here is, due diligence is broader than just looking into where the organisation is right at the moment.
That's right.
So, and obviously, the importance of due diligence is saying, okay, well, what do the financials look like now, and do they look like we're being told? Do they look solid? Are there gaps? And when we're looking at the legal due diligence, we're looking at, are there legal risks sitting within the structure of the organisation, or the documents within the organisation, the relationships within the organisation, the employees, and all of those sorts of things. But what we're also talking about here is assessing it in a broader perspective. So make sure you're doing your research on the market as well, and some of these more external influences, rather than than just those that are internal to the organisation.
That's right. And you mentioned something too about your work and to make sure that the contracts, we see this a lot with people that acquire and don't have an attorney like you that are working. And there can be, gaps in the contracts, and there can be, there can be misunderstandings or just whatever. And that's why, I want to put it back on you saying, people need to really be working with somebody like you. Because it's not just two friends. And where we see it the most is, two people know each other, they're mates, they're friends, whatever you want to call it. And one wants to sell, the other one's willing to buy, and there's this misunderstanding. I'm not going to say it's misrepresentation, but there was that, and you just got to take it out of that and go from there. The other thing, though, that I want to talk about is this, and the risk is for the business that's acquiring the other business, what is their capacity to manage, division or this extra asset? Because it will take resources more than money, and it takes time, effort, attention, and all that kind of stuff. And people look at the blue sky going, oh my God, we can have another $2 million, valuation to our own company by doing this, but who's going to do it? And who's going to execute on it? And how good are they? And if it's at a different location, which most of them are, how are you going to deal with that? And how are you going to deal with the human relations issues and, oversight and supervision, management, leadership, all those kind of things.
So I guess what you're saying here is get real about what the future actually looks like from a practical perspective as well. So let's not just limit it to numbers on a piece of paper. Well, who writes them on a piece of paper anymore? I guess numbers on a spreadsheet. It's also about, practically, how's this going to work from a time and energy perspective, for the investors?
Look, I've seen this happen, not really frequently, but it's been quite devastating, because what happens is that the business that's acquiring doesn't lose one business, they could lose two businesses because they're neglecting their current business trying to acquire this, and both can fall down on their ankles.
Yeah, so let's talk about that, because there's many oft quoted statistics out there that talk about the number or the high percentage of acquisitions that aren't considered at the end of the day a success, in inverted commas. And I say in inverted commas because I think quite often there's a lack of clear definition about what a success in an acquisition means. But so let's talk about that. I mean, obviously, that's the worst case scenario, that an acquisition by one organisation ends up in bringing both of them down. And I was actually talking to a couple of days ago to someone who worked on the M&A team for a very large listed company. And we were just talking about these as general issues in the M&A environment. And he was talking about the organisation he worked for, having gone through a process, I think he said, of, they'd had about 30 acquisitions in total, and they'd gone and they had a real mandate for acquisition to create this an aggregated model across a number of industries. And then 5 years later, they started divesting of all of these businesses, and the share price had just, as they were going up, and this is one thing for acquisitions, it can look really active, and investors like that, whether or not it's a listed entity, and you're talking about shareholders of a public company, you're talking about investors of a small organisation. The blue sky of that concept of acquisition, the activity looks really, or can look really good, but then the reality when you get to integration, and are they actually performing well together? In an exponentially increased way, in this particular organisation led them to divest almost everything that they'd acquired. And so, of course, that is a very expensive process.
Very, very expensive.
And that's a very large example, I guess, of what we're talking about here in a smaller context, which is...
But it's the same principle.
Same principle. So do you have any examples that sort of spring to mind to you of an acquisition that's actually had the reverse impact of tearing both organisations down?
That is what both organizations down, yes. So a number of years ago, I worked with a company that was doing acquisition of smaller. They were in the civil construction, and there are a lot of small tier 3 or even below, and they were just acquiring a bunch of tier 3. And the issue was culture, that the company acquiring was a civil construction, and they were trying to build themselves up to the size of a tier 1. And they were very business minded and financially driven and all these kind of things. Where smaller companies were like smart guys, but it's like they didn't want the corporate world. I mean, they didn't want the bigger world. That's why they were working with these smaller in a smaller company, or they had a smaller company. And it just wasn't. It is like you're saying, it just wasn't working out. Key people left. And that's why what you do is important, is because on an acquisition you want to have non-compete clauses for a number of years. You want to have disclosure clauses and these kind of things. So, but now sometimes, once in a while, someone may want to acquire a company not for the company, but for their customer base or their asset or something. If it's an undervalued customer base or whatever, or they've been trying to get in, or it leverages, it's in a related field and they want to cross-sell to greater numbers.
Cross-sell, that's it, exactly. And that's certainly, a really good reason to use
Absolutely. Absolutely. So it becomes a strategic asset, and you can just let that company run like it's going to. And then, because you're not buying it for the operations, you're buying it for something else. And so whether it's their customer base or it leverages your existing brand too. So of course that's another good reason to do it.
Absolutely. Okay, great. All right. So we've looked at valuations, we've looked at risk management, and of course, risk management, as we said, is one of those areas, of course, where both of our industries, legal and strategic advice, are absolutely critical in helping to identify the risks and how to manage them, because it's not just about identifying them, right? It's about how to
mitigate.
How to mitigate. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And then the last thing, like we talked about, was leverage. Is how do you leverage? So as an example, if some businesses have lots of cash flow, not a lot of expenses, and or you may have great cash flow. And you can leverage, like I said, a common customer base where you can cross-sell or upsell to a greater customer base that already is doing business with your acquisition. If they have technology that you can leverage in your own business. And I don't mean social media or computers, desktops, and phone lines and stuff like that. I'm not talking about that. But if they have proprietary technology, let me give you an example of a maintenance company, and they used Salesforce as their backbone, but they had spent a few $100,000 to modify Salesforce for their maintenance customers. They were large corporates and apartment condominiums and stuff like that. So they could know, so they had, hundreds or even thousands of jobs a day. And so they could monitor every aspect of the work that goes on. And they could also make accurate, proposals and quotes for service and all this kind of stuff. Anyhow, that technology was portable to any type of service business. And, it was worth several millions of dollars. And they were acquired not because of the maintenance business. It was significant business. They probably had, I don't know, when I knew them, about $11.5 million in service. But they had invested in this management system, and that was the reason they were acquired. And the principal was one of these guys that loves to grow things, but then he gets bored with it and he wants to go on to the next conquest. So he was happy. He didn't want to run $11.5 million business. He wanted to go back and do another startup. And some people are just like that. That's why they bought what they bought, was they wanted that developed tech
IP
application.
Yeah.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah, absolutely.
And they can
Which is
leverage
another
that.
great reason for acquisitions. Exactly, absolutely. Okay, and so then how is it that you generally work with businesses through this process then? I mean, as businesses come in, is it one of those things where you sit there and you sort of identify that maybe they have a gap that acquisitions could fill, or what's the process you usually run through?
Okay, we're not usually leading the client when it comes to that. So how typically it'll happen? I've got one M&A client right now in the U.S. and they needed to develop a strategic plan for this, and so I don't typically recommend it, but but the client. We talk about the issues and why they're wanting to do what they are, obviously what their objectives are, and then we just start the research into it. And we use their data and their information. It's very collaborative because they know their industry. We don't know it like they do. And we use their data and we help them create a lot of financial models for it, operational models for it. We look for the risks and we create a 5 to 10 year plan. And the process at a minimum takes 6 months. Because anything, you really have to, as we're just talking about, there's a lot of deep things to kind of think through. And I've got to know, and their credentials as business owners really is secondary. I've really got to get to know the capacity of not only their goals and objectives, but what are their capacities as, as professionals in their business. What are the resources that these are going to take and everything else. And we just really have a very collaborative process, and at the end of it, then we have a plan that they makes more sense to them, that has deeper information, operational, human resources, market information, financial information that they've had. And the thing with plans, of course, is they have to be revised as you go forward. Nothing's etched in stone. And that's what we saw with coronavirus, and it's really interesting because there's a couple companies in the States that I'm working with right now that they say that about 10 to 15% of the businesses that closed during coronavirus aren't going to reopen.
Yeah, wow.
Which is really significant, right? And
that's huge. Is that massive across? Presumably there's specific industries that are most impacted, but is that a broad stretch across multiple industries, or is it really?
Yeah, that's just generally across the board.
Yeah.
And so there's two companies that are strong in their industry, and they're seeing this as an opportunity. And you can look at it two ways. Well, these guys are taking advantage of the situation, maybe, no doubt. But they're also giving an opportunity to businesses that wouldn't reopen anyhow.
Well, that's exactly right, isn't it? And we've had some tough conversations over the past few weeks with clients who are making that decision at the moment. Is it do I have the energy? And
just tired of fighting. That's right.
Well, that's it. And you know what? They don't necessarily label it in that way, but it certainly causes a lot of people to stop and reflect. And for some organisations, it will require a lot of energy. And so, so if they want an out and they don't want to do it, then they're benefited by someone who is coming around and saying, I do have the energy, and we can see how we can pick this up and make it work. So, absolutely. I mean, and there's got to be two sides of the equation so that those who don't want to do the build up again have a way of selling out rather than just closing up and walking out.
That's exactly right.
Because I guess that's the alternative, isn't it?
Yep.
So, and I mean, you're absolutely right. And this is one of the things that I'm really interested in thinking about at the moment. It is, what what does that landscape look like? And I'm not sure, I don't know much about the US in terms of stimulus that has happened for businesses here, but of course
Nothing
here in
like
Australia.
Nothing like
Yeah, right.
Australia.
Is that right? Okay,
Yeah.
that's interesting. And so, and so the big question, of course, here in Australia is what happens, at the end of September, at the beginning of October, or the roll on, November close afterwards. But in the US, I guess this is starting to show through right now. Is that right? They're not in the hibernation that the Australian business zone is sort of.
It varies from state to state. Some states early on just shut down. California was one of them, and Washington. Others continue to operate, but it has affected the whole economy. Just nationally. But there hasn't been the government support. There's been a lot of state support, but they're limited, by their own borrowing powers and legally and everything else. So again, we'll just see what happens. But the reason I bring that up is because what a business was worth last year at this time may not be what the business is worth now.
Of course, absolutely.
So this goes back to valuations, and I just see it as companies that can do it smart, and now the risk, but you don't know how long this risk is going to last. Is it going to be 3 months?
There's a lot, of estimates out there, aren't there? But all we know for sure is that no one actually knows for sure.
That's exactly right.
So, but I guess it's about building the strategy around the possibilities and trying to work out how you'll deal with each ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And can I ask you a question, Richard? Do you see, firstly, a difference in Australia and the US, just generally, in terms of SMEs, so small to medium businesses approaching acquisitions? Is there a difference in Australia versus the US, in your opinion?
Look, the United States is my home base, and there is more venture capital available in the States than I think is available in Australia. And commercial lenders, whether it's the banks or private commercial lenders, want to have hard collateral if you're going to get a commercial loan. And it's really difficult to get investment without it. Now, having said that, the government has lots of grant programs. And I've got a couple of databases that I work off of, but we're talking hundreds and hundreds of grant programs. And they're pretty transparent, and the government is not in the business of giving away money, but what they're in the business of is economic stimulus. They need a return like any investor on their money, and that return comes in wages and people that generate economic activity that increases tax revenues and all this kind of stuff. And I think Australia's really smart about that. So I would say the private sector and with private lenders, unless you have an hard asset that can be a security, it's really tough or impossible to get commercial loan. Venture capital is here, but it's not as plentiful as it is in, like, let's say the States, because the economy in the States is 16 times what it is in Australia. And that's can be difficult, but it's there. But you need to start looking well before you need the investment.
Yeah. Okay, well, look, that has been a fabulous run through talking about these areas for consideration in growth through acquisition. If any of our listeners are interested in making contact with you, how do they do that?
Well, I have a couple Facebook pages, Richard Osmann or Rich Osmann, and Provanedge. I'm on LinkedIn as well. Or they can send an email to richard@provanedge.com.
Brilliant. Absolutely fabulous. Well, look, Richard, thank you so much for coming on to the show today. Any parting words that you want to leave our audience with as they're thinking about this area?
Well, I would say that they need to talk to you because legal... No, seriously. And
I should have you on more often. I love guests.
I'm not trying to fluff you up, but you need to be their first protocol because you're a lot more than just a legal pro. You're also a business advisor. And they need to have somebody like you that knows the laws, knows the ins and outs, and all the other aspects of it as well. But because this is the thing, we don't know everything. Nobody knows everything, and to have you be their first protocol really is just just makes the process so much easier.
Well, Richard, you are fabulous. I promise you, our listeners, I did not pay Richard to say that.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. You didn't.
I love it.
If you want professional results, you use a professional. You don't do it yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. And we all know there are differences. There are professionals and then there are professionals. So it's also about choosing your deal team, and understanding what it is you're looking for, I guess.
That's right.
Brilliant. Well, look, Richard, I just want to say a massive thank you for coming on to the show. Of course,
my pleasure.
You are running along the beach right now or on your way on your commute to somewhere, you might be on a commute now, it seems that the roads are heating up, then we will put links through to Richard in our show notes so you can make contact with him. Richard, thank you so much.
My pleasure.
Well, that's it for today's episode, which is another episode in our Growth Through Acquisition series. And of course, today we talked about the strategic considerations. In particular, we talked about valuations and about knowing the pictures behind the numbers. We talked about risk management, so understanding what can go wrong, how it can go wrong, and what you can do ahead of time to minimize the risks. And we also talked about how the acquisition can leverage your existing business because, of course, that's the point of it all, isn't it? Leveraging your existing business. So that's it. I just want to say, as always, a very big thank you for listening into the episode today. If you'd like more information about this topic, you probably know the drill by now, but just head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com and there you'll be able to download a transcript of this podcast episode if you're one of those people who just likes to read these things in detail rather than just listening in. Now, at that website or in the show notes, if you prefer, you'll also find details of how to contact Richard Osmann. There you'll also be able to find details of how to contact our legal eagles at Aspect Legal if you or your clients would like to talk about an upcoming acquisition or exit. We would be only too happy to assist you in talking about the strategy and, of course, the legal issues that go along with preparing for acquisition or exit or actually getting the transaction done. Well, that's it. I just want to say another massive thank you for listening in. You have been listening to Joanna Oakey and the Deal Room Podcast, a podcast very proudly brought to you by our commercial legal practice, Aspect Legal. See you next time. Aspect Legal has a number of great services that help businesses prepare for a sale or acquisition, to help them prepare in advance and to get transaction ready. We've also got a range of services to help guide businesses through the sale and acquisitions process. We work with clients both big and small and have different types of services depending on size and complexity. We provide a free consultation to discuss your proposed sale or acquisition. So see our show notes on how to book a time to speak with us or head over to our website at aspectlegal.com.au.
Ladies and gentlemen.
That will conclude this evening's entertainment.
Thanks for listening to the Deal Room Podcast. To find out more about this episode and other episodes in the series, check out the show notes or head over to our website at thedealroompodcast.com.au.